species and which side, what's going on. And maybe some of you know Bob, but he's a range scientist, president of SRM, and now he works with the Wyoming Wildlife Group. And one time he came to campus and I had him in class to talk about, in that case, he was talking about sage grouse and grazing 15 years ago. And one of the students said, "Hey, Mr. Budd, I got a question." He says, "Is grazing good or bad for sage grouse?" And Bob said, "Yes, it is good or bad for sage grouse." And that's the net essence of livestock wildlife interactions. I will say, in my career, I've started out with most people, if they thought if you wanted to save wildlife, get rid of cows, right? That was it. I think it's turning the other way now. So I'm going to try to give you some real evidence that maybe the working with livestock and keeping those lands open is what we need to do for wildlife too. So that's my plea. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about this 10-year study that we've done on grouse and grazing, give you some data. So first, let's just start with some concepts. So is it good, bad, or indifferent? It really depends. Some situations, some interactions are really hard to deal with, like the one over there on the left, which is domestic sheep and bighorn sheep. Well, that's a tough one. I hope science can help us with that someday, but when the solution is keeping them apart from each other, that's a tough solution. So that's one, that's a tough one. On the other side, cows and elk, they talk together, they work together, they eat the same stuff, they're there. So we can use cows to manage wildlife habitat, in this case, elk. I've also noticed that most of the literature on elk or livestock wildlife interactions is the effect of livestock on the wildlife, not so much the other way around. But elk certainly have an effect on our livestock operations too. So it depends. That's a total range science answer, isn't it? Okay, so I also want to point out, cows don't just appear. They come with some infrastructure. So it's not so much about livestock wildlife interactions as ranching and wildlife. I think those, we might want to think more about ranching. So because livestock comes with things like water, fences, large blocks of land, weed control, disturbance. Some of those are good and some are bad. So I'll try to give you some kind of anecdotes and research along the way here, but just the whole theme of this is sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. I hope to give you some ammunition. Okay, what are some, I gotta start with the negative because you know that I'm gonna talk mostly about the positive stuff, right? But there's some bad things that you can, there is evidence, certainly research on, and some that we all know as range scientists. So first one I'm gonna put up there is riparian degradation. That's not good for anybody. It's not good for cows, it's not good for amphibians or anything in the water. And what's cool about that is in my time, okay, when I went to school in the previous century, we didn't even use the word riparian. We called it sacrifice land that you used to water the cows, right? Okay, we've come a long way. We do know the principles of how to manage lands and how to improve riparian ecosystems. You can totally graze most lands and have a healthy riparian. I will say there's some spots that it's really hard to do both, but we can do it. We're really good at that now. It's one thing I've seen in range management that has really changed in the last 20 years. So it can be bad. If you want to just Google the internet and talk about overgrazing and riparian areas, you're going to get a lot of pictures like this one. Okay, it's out there, but we can manage it. Yes, cows. I'm going to use cows and elk again as an example. They eat the same stuff. They eat the same kind of grass. But just because they're eating the same sort of grass doesn't mean they're competing with each other. I think people oftentimes just jump to that conclusion. So it can be bad. Elk can eat more and not have enough left for the cows, or vice versa. Hiding cover, yes, when you start grazing grass, you start reducing nesting cover for birds and small habitat for small rodents and ground nesting amphibians, or I mean reptiles. And yes, you can have disease transmission. Other things is some things we know less about. The disturbance. I was working on a project at a wildlife management area in Idaho, and if you asked the wildlife biologist I was working with how disturbing having the cows move through in the corners, they said, "Oh gosh, it's really bad." And then if you asked the rancher that was at that, he would say, "Oh, it's no big deal." So what's the answer? It's somewhere in between, and it probably depends on what kind of operation you have. But yes, ranching can disturb wildlife when they're fawning and calving. Can we reduce nest sites for upland game birds and waterfowl? Yes, we can reduce the grass to a point where it's not a good nest site. show you the data on sage grouse in a minute. I often read in the public literature about cows stepping on nests. I'm just going to say flat out, that doesn't happen very often. Cows are avoiding those kinds, they like clear paths. So yes, it does happen. And yes, you can find it in the literature, but I don't see that as a really big problem with livestock and wildlife interactions. Yeah, reduced cover is a problem, especially for ground nesting birds. And attracting predators is still a little bit out. There's not a lot of data on it. We've done some research that, yeah, there's more coyotes that hang around cows. And I sometimes think sheep are designed to attract predators, you know, like they're little prey items walking along. So I do know that it happens, but again, there's just not as much data on it. I think it's just something that we know. Okay, so let's turn to the positive. One thing that's really positive, I think, is that we're good on, as ranchers and landowners, we're good at creating water for animals. Okay, we often create it for our livestock, but the wildlife use it. We can maintain water quality pretty easily with some good management. I'm gonna kind of go on record and say, I don't think you can improve water quality, but you can certainly maintain it. We can improve forage quality. Cows are pretty good at getting rid of the old, dense, mucky stuff and leaving the good regrowth for wildlife behind it. We can manage habitat and cover. I think one of the good kind of win-wins is cows eat grass, no surprise, but that is competition for shrubs. So especially as we go into this winter where those elk and deer are needing the shrubs because the shrubs have lots of protein and vitamins in it. If you've eaten the grass, if cows have eaten the grass, it makes it easier for the shrubs to grow. In fact, there have been some studies in Utah that unless you had cows, you couldn't have good shrubs for wildlife in the winter because they just wouldn't grow. They wouldn't outcompete. So we could increase wildlife populations. Again, that's difficult to prove. If you improve the habitat, you should improve the population. Okay, let's go back to water. So while we're creating ponds and reservoirs and troughs to provide water for cows, it is providing water for wildlife. There's some old studies that said that pronghorn, which are all across the sagebrush steppe now, right? They weren't historically because there wasn't enough water. But when we came in and created ponds and troughs for cattle, the pronghorn are now quite widespread, largely because of those developed water sources. And of course, amphibians, waterfalls, waterfowl species that are nesting in the areas, and then pollinators that are using those wet spots. Those are all really important. I love it in the Owahis where they're using cattle ponds or improving cattle ponds for endangered spotted frogs. Hearing some of those ranchers talk about their love of spotted frogs is pretty fun because it's a win-win. Riparian areas around water developments, again, are really important for diversity, pollinators. That's good for cows. It's good for wildlife. So it's a win-win. I think us improving water sources is generally a good thing. Here's the one that I think is going to make the biggest difference is the large landscapes. My goal in life, like as I think that I've only got that so many decades left in my life, I want more large, open, working landscapes, right? That's good for ranching. That's good for wildlife. That's good for water. And so that's what I think ranching, if we think about ranches, that's one way we can do it. I'm afraid I can't buy very many ranches. I just don't have the pocketbook. But I can work with people to try to maintain those large landscapes, work with you ranchers, because I think that's really what's going to keep the West healthy, not only the wildlife, but our rural communities too. Get off my soapbox in here, keep going. Connectivity is really important. State Department of Fish and Wildlife or Fish and Game is really has some new agendas on connectivity. It's starting to help us think about not only what does this piece of ground look like, but where are the important pieces of ground in a row to give that access for animals. Okay, fences, I'm just going to say, are usually not a good thing for wildlife. There are some animals that sit on them and need them, but they're not very good for pronghorn or elk. Elk can do devastating things to fences. But we're getting better at fences, right? We have wildlife-friendly fence, and now the newest kid on the block is virtual fence. I'm a huge promoter of virtual fence. We're creating a whole different system at the University of Idaho to try to get rid of a lot of those interior fences. So I think we're going to use our innovation and get over some of those obstacles. I'm going to say here's a fence line contrast from the Murphy Complex fire, not too far away, that Neil Rimby took. So here the fire is coming from the left side, going along fine, and hits a fence, and it stops because the right side was grazed. right? I love these fence line contrasts because grazing can really reduce fuels and manage wildfire risk. But this is not the important thing. The important thing is when grazing reduces the fuel loads and reduces the severity of the fire, or maybe makes it more patchy. Sure, it's fun to see contrast and like see the fire stop at a line. But the more important thing that's happened out there is grazed pastures, the fires go through and it's not as intense. So more of the native plants survive, or it might be more patchy. So there's some seed sources around. So I think that's what's really important, is that patchier fires. And then I love what's happening here. Idaho, we're a real leader in these rangeland fire protection associations. So those ranchers realize that they have a stake in the game, and some agencies finally got around and said, yeah, you do have a stake in the game. Let's work together. So now several really productive rangeland fire protection associations, and the data is pretty good in Idaho that those ranchers who are on the ground, that are the first responders, are making a difference, and our fires are smaller. Fire's a weird one because it's an important part of our ecosystem, but we've got to find ways to deal with and make fire smaller. So I think that's an important part about ranching. Um, uh, Moderate grazing really does promote diversity. One of the big themes of the International Year of Rangelands Pastoralists is on the global scale, grazing is really important to maintain biodiversity. So it's a weird time when in my life I'm working with people that publish in conservation biology and they have degrees in conservation biology. It's kind of a weird time. Ranchers, when I grew up, I didn't think I'd be working with people who are trying to create pollinator habitat. But we are, because those grazers really do create that diversity, which is needed. Again, it's patchy at small microsites, and then it's also because cows eat grass, they can release those forbs and those shrubs, which are really the kind of for increase in biodiversity. And then I'm gonna go back to that point about shrubs, especially for many wildlife species that have to survive in the winter without hay and supplement, they need shrubs. If you don't have grazing, it's hard to really promote those shrubs. And so that's one of the really important tools, I think, of cattle grazing, especially. Okay, one time I was doing this in class and one of the students said, it's not about grazing, it's about responsible grazing. And Barry Perryman from the University of Nevada, Reno always says, grazing is not a noun, it's a verb, because there's all different kinds of grazing. It happens in a lot of different ways. So I'm not going to talk about removing grazing. I don't think removing grazing is important. I think it's about changing and molding and using grazing. And, range science is actually a pretty young science. The first PhD in range was in 1950. So it's not even 100-year-old profession. We're learning a lot. We have learned a lot. We can do grazing responsibly. So come to the University of Idaho and get a degree in range, right? That's the way to do it. And I'll talk a little bit about strategic rest and deferment, which is the basis for the sage-grouse study, and then targeted grazing. New thing on the block. It's about 10 years old now that we've really been talking about targeted grazing. So you can make a living just grazing for landscape management, not for pounds of animal. As long as you keep the habitat in mind, you can use those livestock to manage wildlife habitat. Livestock grazing, it can be good or it can be bad. It really depends on the species of livestock and the species of wildlife. When you're grazing, the situation, types of plants, sometimes you're in a situation you can't change with grazing. Topography, that'll trump it all the time. Cover attributes, what do you got? What do you need to change to? And then the skills of the manager. We all know good people. We all know people out there that just have this keen insight on how to manage that land and really make it into what they want. I think of it as art. Well, the field of range management is known as a science and an art. So I think of those producers as art. I don't know how they do it. It's just that all that skill in all those years, that some people are just better at it than others. So it really depends on the skill of a manager. And you can't just take someone who got a degree in range that they're just getting started and turn them into a great manager. It takes years. Mother Nature is the good teacher. And so my hat goes off to all of you who have learned from Mother Nature the hard way and have that skill to change landscapes. Okay, with that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about this. It's a really unprecedented, interesting study that we did in Idaho. It all started a little more than 10 years ago. on a ranch south down by Rogerson when Burt Brackett, Senator Brackett, took myself and Jack Connolly from Idaho Fish and Game and got us out there on the ranch. And in total, if you know Burt, in total Burt style, took us out on the range and looked over the whole range and said, okay, you guys, I'm pretty worried about this sage grouse and how that's going to affect grazing. You guys need to figure it out. We need some science. And I mean, he wasn't gentle. It was like, you guys need to figure this out. And I have to tell you, when Burt Brackett tells me to do something, I do it. And so he helped us get started. And then shortly, Jack Connolly connected with a new leader in the Fish and Wildlife Service in the co-op unit in Idaho, and that was Courtney Conway. And Courtney is the one who really helped us get through this decade-long study. But if you look along the bottom there, it was a wide group of people. BLM was the main one that came to the plate and put the money in for the project because they're the ones that needed the answers. Forest Service was there. Fish and Game played a huge role. The USGS with Courtney Conway, the Idaho Cattle Association, the Public Lands Council, the University of Idaho Range Livestock Center. It was a pretty interesting mix of people. And why did we come together? Because we needed the answer. We were not there to prove anything. I think kind of in our own like closets, I kind of wanted to prove the cows were great. And I'm sure there were people that wanted to prove the cows were bad. But we came together and we said, we just need to figure out what's going on. We need to figure out what is the effect of spring grazing on cattle. And that was important at that time because there was a lot of work being done to reduce or remove spring grazing, especially on federal lands, because it was going to be bad for grouse. So we needed the answer, because if you don't have some good science that everyone can agree on, then my word is as good as yours. And you can prove whatever you want with science. So you have to have a united group to try to really find out what the answer is. So that's what this group was. Oh, I also want to thank the permittees. Gosh, to ask permittees across Idaho to change their permits, to change their cattle, move their cattle, it was a lot, and they came to the plate. So thanks to permittees. Jim Sage over here, Browns Bench, not too far from here. Okay, here's where it all started. Okay, no doubt, many of you probably remember stories from your grandparents and stuff about all the grouse that there were. And that's true. There were lots of grouse in the 20s, 30s, 40s. But from when we started taking good records of grouse in the 60s, it's been a pretty downward trajectory. So here is kind of the downward truth of that you can't argue with this. And I'm kind of sad that as many things as we've done in the last 10 years, this line is not going up. You know, we have the sage grouse initiative and we're planting lands and we're restoring sagebrush. It's not going up. So there's something going on. And what was the first animal that we thought could be the problem? Cows. Here's an interesting thing about cows. When I started studying this, I went to the Cattle Association. This is the numbers during that same period, grouse were going down. This is the cattle permits in federal lands. It's also going down. So it was hard for a lot of people to believe that as we're reducing cattle numbers across the West, sage grouse are going down. It seems hard to think that one is a cause of the other. And Cameron Mulrooney with the Idaho Cattle Association, he says, it's not that cows were like an easy answer. It's just that they were an easy target. You knew who owned them. They were on permits. You could manage them. It's hard to manage some other things. Okay, so this is true, right? Cows are going down, grouse are going down. So what's changing? What is changing in the last 20 years, 30 years? Come on. Participation. I'm gonna start calling names. Got one? Horses. Yeah, there are, especially in Nevada, a lot more horses. And if you think cows are hard on habitat, you probably could confirm this. Horses are pretty tough. Other things that have changed? Come on, it's not the same as it was. People, what are people doing?
Recreating, building houses.
Recreating, building houses, putting transmissions lines out, putting out roads. Yeah, our influence on the land, way different in the last 20, 30 years. Other things? Fire, lots of fire. More, bigger, more intense fires. It was not that long when I first came to Idaho, like a 1 million acre fire was a huge thing. And it's still a very big thing, but it's pretty common now. Other things? Invasive species, especially cheatgrass, which feeds into fire. Anyone know? Did I hear another one?
Climate change.
Disease, yeah. Okay. Climate change, which feeds into fire and weeds. And also diseases like we're really worried about avian flu, et cetera. Okay, so at the same time, those numbers are going down. Wildfires are going up. Common ravens, they're ravens, so that's a predators, we didn't talk about that. Okay, we have a hard time controlling some of those, but we can manage cows. So that was kind of the gist of this. We needed the data to manage the cows. So we did a replicated study. So here's some elements of a replicated study. I will go kind of tell them along the way is like, not all science is good science. I can say that as a scientist perhaps. And so replicated just means that we did it more than one place at one year. So we totally replicated this. And what we measured was sage grouse demographics. That's stuff like how many eggs do they lay, how many eggs are hatch, and how long do the chicks live. That's how heavy is the hen. That's the demographics. The sage grouse habitat features, that's how much the cover of shrubs, what's the height of grasses. We also looked at utilization patterns. We had hundreds of students, young professionals working with us, and we would send them across these pastures that were, tens of thousands of acres. And we'd say, okay, when you get to the other side, turn around and come back. And as you go, mark how much utilization you see. So we have these big utilization maps of landscape appearance of each of the pastures. And then arthropods, insects abundance, because there was some research about this time showed that insects apparently were more abundant in grazed pastures, and that's important to grouse because they need insects to eat. So those were the main things that we studied. My part of this really was just the utilization and the habitat stuff. I don't know much about grouse, so please don't ask me grouse questions. We'll find someone else out here that knows it. So I was really on the cow side of things. And I'm going to say this several times, this was unprecedented. I've never been involved in anything like this study. We have the first major report, the first peer-reviewed report out. So if you want to see the final report, it's called Idaho Grouse Grazing.org. It's about a 70-page report, but there's a really nice executive summary in about 4 pages. So if you wanted to get the gist of it, I'll give this again at the end. But this is a citable study. It was peer-reviewed. It is published. It is free for use. Okay, so let's get into it. I'm going to give you the cliff notes of what's in the study. Okay, first of all, it's unprecedented because we use some big landscapes. We were in Idaho. It sure would have been fun to go to Wyoming or Nevada or Washington or Oregon, but we did stick in Idaho because the Idaho BLM was really supportive of this research. So those are the 5 sites that we went to. You see, there's just a few not far from here, Twin Falls. And then we went all the way up to the Cimarron. So 5 different sites, about 10 years in total, at least 6 years at each site. Some years went as long as 10. Okay, here's another thing that makes it a truly rigorous research study is first thing we did was we spent 2 years at a site just trying to see what's going on at each site. Where are the birds? Where are they nesting? Where are they lekking? Where are the cattle? So we really spent 2 years just letting life go as it had for a long time, using the same permits BLM was using and looking at where the grouse were. And then this was every site, this was a really interesting day when we sat down with the range management specialists with BLM and with the ranchers, and we flipped a coin and we said, okay, which one of these pastures is going to be grazed in the spring of odd years, the spring of even years, which ones are going to have to not be grazed for 6 years, or 4 more years at least, and then which ones are going to be grazed in the spring and the fall. So that was a little tense because some people really, they had, especially the ranchers and the specialists, the range specialists, they had pastures that they wanted to use every year or not. But we did, it made it a random application of pastures in the study. So that gives it some reputation, and that's another thing that makes it a bit unprecedented. People have asked me why we did spring grazing, and sure, it would have been fun to do cattle grazing and sheep grazing and spring grazing and summer grazing. We just had to focus on something, and at that time and until today, spring grazing is the niche of it's kind of the rub of the matter, because that's when grouse are nesting, and that's when they need that nesting cover right around the nest. So that's why we studied spring grazing, and we did that across those 5 sites. Okay, another unprecedented thing. Over the years, every year in the spring, we would collect hens, put radio collars on them so we could track them and find out where their nests were. And over the 10 years of the study, we've collected 1,300 grouse. This is the biggest study in terms of grouse that have been collected that's been published, so it is a big deal. My hat is off to people that can stay up all night and catch grouse, and I'm pretty impressed that they were able to get to that. Okay, I will say that grouse is a little complicated. I'm gonna tell you about kind of how we started and what we found. Yeah, in the middle of that picture, perhaps you see that grouse under that, those shrubs, and she's sitting on a nest. And that is the crux of the matter. We studied from when those little eggs were laid to when the brood was hatched and what that success rate was. Okay, here's what made it a little complicated. This is data from our study and others. It's really well documented that if you just looked at the grass, okay, grass height is important because if you had grass around that nest, it keeps it from predators smelling the nest or seeing the nest. So grass height is important around a nest. And if you just throw a spot out on the ground and you measure randomly across a pasture, grass height will be lower than a nest site. So there's the failed and hatched nests, and you'll see that leftmost bar is lower. And then what's really interesting is the grass height around failed nests is lower than the grass height around hatched nests or successful nests. Okay, so that means that grass is important, right? That to have a hatched nest, you need tall grass. This is really well documented. And then here's this other thing that we really well documented by measuring almost 500,000 plants is when you graze a plant, it gets shorter. Shocking, I know. So these were the main plants that we found, and you can see that the gold bar, the ungrazed bar, is higher than the grazed bar. Okay, so you're tracking with me here. It's not higher science. If grazing reduces grass height, and grass height is important to successful nests, then grazing is bad, right? It's pretty logical. It was hard to fight against that, and that's what was going into courts, getting on BLM desks and saying, you got to get the cows off in the spring because they're reducing grass height. I can't refute either of those points, but it turns out that 1 + 2 does not equal 3 in this case. There's something else going on here. So here's some of the data that we found is you'll see that we looked at random plots, and yes, grass height, which is on the left, grass height is lower in grazed pastures than rested pastures. So the rested pastures are the diamonds. So, oh, shocking, cows reduce grass height, and you can measure that at the pasture level. However, when you look at failed versus hatched nests, those are not different. So grass is shorter in grazed pastures, but grass height around failed nests is similar to in grazed and rested pastures. So grass height is still important, but it's the same whether it's in a grazed or ungrazed pasture. And then even if you look at successful nests, grass height around hatched nests is similar in grazed and ungrazed pastures. Okay, well, that seems like a conundrum. It is a conundrum. That we still have lower grass height. We know that cows affect grass height, and yet those grouse are somehow able to find a nest to be successful in grazed or ungrazed pastures. Or the stupid grouse, whatever, the unexperienced grouse, that can't find a successful nest. It's just as likely to happen in a grazed or ungrazed pasture. Okay, here's another cool way to look at that. Over those 10 years, we had studies, we have nests that we can say were in pastures that were currently being grazed, that were recently grazed, or they were grazed a few months ago, the fall before, or years and years ago. There's no trend here. That's just a flat line. In other words, nesting success is no higher in pastures that were rested than in those that were currently grazed or recently grazed. So there's no line there. A nest is just as successful. It can be successful in any of those conditions. So the bottom line is, if you remove grazing, it's really not going to do anything. If you remove grazing for 3 years, that success rate is no different than the current success rate as a percentage. Okay, just a few more, kind of go down to the weeds a little more. Another thought was, well, maybe grouse are doing this and they're avoiding grazed pastures. Maybe they're kind of going up to the fence and going, oh man, cows have been here, I'm leaving. Not true. All of these lines are the same. So a grouse did not avoid grazed pastures. Nest density was the same whether the pasture was being grazed, was spring grazed, or spring and fall grazed. So grouse are not avoiding grazed pastures. And now let's go to brood survival, because that's really the important thing. Hatch nest means like, did the eggs hatch? But then what happened to the chicks? What's the brood survival? And it turns out brood survival is similar whether the pasture was grazed in the spring or rested in the spring. This line over there, that looks like it's different. Statistically, it's not. It looks like spring and fall grazing gives better brood success. That's not statistically significant. And we didn't have a lot of pastures in that treatment. So it's kind of interesting that maybe that combination could be beneficial. At least it's not worse. Okay, now those students that were walking across those pastures, if you look on the right-hand side there, that's pictures of pastures for random sage. And when it's light, that means it was grazed that year. And when it was dark, it means it wasn't grazed that year. And so we have, grazing going across those three pastures. Okay, here is a legitimate criticism of the study. If you look right over here in that yellow bars, that's the actual level of utilization that we had in the year that we grazed the plots, the pastures. Okay, the problem is, look at that, the highest number there's 30 something. So we never achieved more than 33% utilization. And most people, including me, I'm sure I've talked about, they take half, leave half, 50%, or we have goals of 40 or 60%. And in this case, we never were able to accomplish really heavy grazing. And we did not set the grazing levels. That was the range management specialist and the BLM working with the ranchers. We did not change their grazing plans. So my take home here, this is normal grazing. I've looked at a lot of permits, and I've worked with range management folks in BLM across the state. This is pretty common. And we have some BLM folks here, so maybe you'll weigh in, but although I think some people in the public would say BLM land is really overgrazed, it's like 70 or 80% grazed. I've not seen it. Maybe around water tanks, sure, but not in our pastures.
Was that all hand collection of utilization, or was there any technology, satellite imagery, or anything used?
We used several different methods for utilization, but we did not use technology. Maybe mostly because of 10 years ago, that wasn't very possible. So we used landscape appearance, and then we used grass height, and then we did utilization impact. So that's a super good question, because I think in the future we'll be able to give a good answer to that. But at least in our study, yes, it was low. Would the results of our study have been different if we had had 70 or 80% utilization? Yeah, probably. We just don't know what it would have been. Wendy Pratt, who's a rancher that was on our advisory team, she wanted us to push and push and push, but then there's these court cases that set how many animals you can have in a permit, and there's long-term permit renewals. Go ahead, you know about this place right here, don't you, Ken? Tell me.
Maybe some of the details, those are the details of, right? So it wasn't that BLM or Forest Service didn't want to allow heavier grazing, it's that the permits and resource management plans had established what levels we could be reserved. And then the permits allowed seasons of use to when the cattle could be there. So the grazing regulations would not allow a quick change on those without environmental studies, decisions, etc. That would take long.
Right, okay, thank you, Ken, for that clarification, that we could have changed it over time if we had had a reason to do it, but we weren't on the timeline of this study. You just keep shaking your head if I'm saying it right. And then, however, you did allow us to change the season, to manage the season.
Yeah, there were certain changes and adjustments that could be made as long as they were within the boundaries of the permit. So numbers of cows, a little bit of this, that, you shift it around, but the number of cows, the number of AUMs, and the general season didn't do something.
Right, so we stayed within the boundaries of the permit. We did not dictate that, other than trying to accomplish our season of grazing. So yeah, maybe I hope that some work could follow up to see what really heavy grazing might do to grouse. But at least I think this was normal grazing. I think it was at levels that would be permitted grazing levels. Okay, now I don't know if you've ever done this kind of AIC analysis, but let me give the gist here. This is nest success of sage grouse in the pastures that we looked at. And if you the way this analysis works is, as you go down, we looked at everything we measured, and we said, how important is this to nest success? As you go further down on the list, it says it's less and less and less and less important. So we usually look at just the first 4 or 5, getting these AIC model numbers pretty high. And what is in those top numbers? Incubation, initiation, when did the nest start? What was the spring temperature? What's interesting is grazing treatment's not in there. Not in any of those models was the grazing treatment important to nest success. Here's another, this is looking at nest success, but we added a few more things to the model. We added the actual percent utilization instead of just the grazing treatment. Again, the top things that were affecting success was when the nest started, what the temperature was, and the site, which site was it on. Grazing doesn't come in until way down in the equation, that it had a negative effect. So grazing didn't come down until pretty far down in the effect. Okay, in this case, it's kind of with the higher levels of grazing, had lower nest success, which is kind of expected, but it didn't come in until way late in the model. Okay, I'm gonna just slip to insects then. The insects are important because when a chick is born, that first few days of its life, first few weeks, it needs really high energy. That's any animal does, needs really high protein and energy. Grass doesn't do it. Forbs are better, they need forbs, but they're still not good enough, they need insects. So that's been pretty well shown that they really need some high quality foods. And then, as I mentioned before, some studies had shown that cows might actually increase the amount of insects on the land, and that might increase the food source. So we put out these pits at our sites at where we had nest sites, and 1,200 pit samples of insects. And then we took some students and chained them to chairs in the lab. Well, I don't think we chained them. Just scratch that off the record. When we have a lot of students that took on jobs during the school year and went through those insects. Had a student who this was her thesis, and they said, well, what is the deal? Is there more insects on grazed than ungrazed? And unfortunately, it's yeah, maybe. On some sites, if you look on the biomass lines, they're Big Butte, no difference between grazed and ungrazed pastures. Browns Bench, it looks like the no grazed pastures had more insects. To go to Jim Sage, it looks like the grazed pastures have more insects. So overall, the amount of insects, the biomass of insects really seems to be site dependent. Same with diversity. There was some pastures where we had a greater diversity of insects in those pits, others not. So again, it's about the same. What the next step on this is the data is hinting at is some of the insects that are more important for grouse food, like ants. Like ants are pretty important because they just walk by grouse and they can pick them off as they go. Grasshoppers, not so much. It's a little harder for a little chick to catch a grasshopper, right? So there's some types of insects that are more important than others. So that's what we're digging in. And it looks like it's possible that those the more insects are more abundant on grazed. So we're digging that way. Yeah, Ken.
You said range sites, are you meaning range sites as in terms of different kinds of range sites or
You caught me.
vegetation or just locations?
You caught me. When I'm talking about sites, I'm talking about the 5 research sites. But you're right, that could also vary by ecological site or range site. But yeah, I'm just talking about these places, Browns Bench versus Big Bend in Butte. So, okay, so I wish I could say, oh yeah, we got it. We don't have it yet. I will say that when we started this research, it looked like it was definitely going to be that grazed pastures had more insects and more diverse insects. And then as we kept going, it kind of watered out. So that's one advantage of a 10-year study is things that look like they're going to work in the beginning. By the time you get to the end of it, may not. So this was one of those. Yeah, go ahead, Angie.
So
Andrea.
was there any correlation with precipitation and insect population? Because, so I was the range con on Browns Bench for the first 3 years study with in Jarvis Field office. And so I'm just thinking about, as I sit here on January 7th, and I look outside, and we have a range management specialist from Fairfield who just informed me that we have no snow up there. Higher peaks. That's gonna have a direct that potentially, I should say, can have a direct correlation with where we are in the insect population.
So, Andrew, so you bring up a really good point that spring, those spring precipitation and spring temperatures is definitely going to change not only the insect community, but the forb community and the grass community. And it's also going to be hard on those little grouse. A cold, wet spring is hard on lambs and it's hard on grouse too. So that's why I think precipitation and spring temperatures come out in our models. It might be because they're directly affecting the grouse. It might be because they're affecting other things too. And so, yeah, if I live long enough, I might be able to answer that. There's a lot.
Don't make that your priority as you retire. Yeah, just say it. We love you.
It's either that or knitting. I'm not sure which. No, I think this is just the tip of the iceberg. We collected a bunch of data. So those questions are really important. Like, what is the next important question? Because we're not going to be able to answer it all. So, so please grab me while we're here and say, what is the one thing that you really wondered? And if we can answer it with our data, we will. I think the next step we're going to take will be to be looking at that brood success more carefully. And then also looking at how the sites, the research sites varied in forbs and grasses, and whether grazing had an effect on that. Okay, so here's our planning team. Again, I really want to put my hat off to these people. We got ranchers on this team, we got range management folks, we have BLM scientists, we got fish and game folks. We have Cattle Association helps with funding. They weren't actually right at the table with the decisions. But it was a really diverse team, and we didn't agree on anything except that we wanted to find out what happened. And it was a long study. I know these people really well after 10 years, and I think we had some really good successes. Okay, so I'm gonna read for you the results, the final thing that comes out of the paper. This is what I want you to leave with today. While grazing reduces grass height, this study showed that sage-grouse nesting success was no greater in rested than currently or recently grazed pastures. The findings of this research give no indication that removing cattle from pastures affected nesting success. The study shows no compelling evidence of increased nest density once grazing is stopped or in ungrazed pastures. And brood success varies by site and year, but shows no strong negative effect to grazing. So that's kind of the bottom lines, and it's why you might Google my name and see that I'm being targeted by people who don't want to hear this. Because that's what the data showed us, and everyone on the team will stand by these major findings. So I'm excited about being part of the study. I also can say it was really fun to try to do something for 10 years, because most of the time we do studies that are a couple of years. And so to do something that's long, and I'm also really proud of the fact, I really want to thank Courtney Conway. We could have not done this without him. He was really the leader there. And I'm really happy that after 10 years, we're still talking together. We're still friends. I mean, the research team stuck together. So thanks to the agencies who supported this research and were willing to find the answer. I'm especially interested that the Cattle Association, the Public Lands Council, I thought they might be hesitant, because I told them you might not like the answer. And they said, no. We got a pretty good idea that cows and grazing can work together. So we want the answer. So the bottom line, it is true that cows, they don't make the world better for grouse, but they are compatible with grouse grazing. So that is my story. I'm sticking to it. I'm happy to have any more insight or questions.
Can you go back one slide so I can write down the page?
Yeah, I can also, that link is where you'll find that data. Any other thoughts? Okay, well, I'm happy that research now, when people try to make policies or change the way they're grazing, at least they have something to really set that on this research. So it was an absolute pleasure to be with you all today, and we'll talk after this. Thanks.